Eli Bannister could not see the girl who came stumbling up his lane, but he felt the tremor running through her knuckles the moment she gripped his porch rail, and he knew fear when his own hands touched it. Dawn came slow over Bannister Ridge that spring, the kind of dawn that arrived in silver rather than gold, frost still silvering the fence posts, though the worst of the long winter had broken 2 weeks past. Smoke rose thin and straight from the cabin chimney, no wind yet to bend it, and somewhere behind the barn, the windmill groaned through its first stiff turn of the day, iron complaining against iron before it found its rhythm. The creek beyond the near pasture ran loud with snowmelt, louder than it had any right to be so early in the season, and the mud along the county road had not yet stiffened with the coming frost of night's leaving. It was the kind of hush a blind man learns to love, because in it every sound stood alone and told him exactly what it was. Eli stood on the porch with his hand resting on the post he had notched 1,000 mornings running, counting nothing in particular, only feeling the day arrive the way he always did, through the cold on his cheek and the smell of wet cedar and turned earth. Sarah's chores were already moving somewhere behind him, the clink of a bucket, the scrape of a boot on the threshold, the low hum of a hymn she did not know she was humming. Down past the barn, a cow lowed twice and went quiet, and the guide rope he had strung years ago from post to post creaked faint under a breeze rising off the thawing prairie. He might have stood there another hour in that stillness, had the dog not gone rigid at his knee, a low growl rising from somewhere deep in its chest, aimed down the long gray ribbon of the county road at a shape that had not been there the evening before, a shape moving slow and uneven, the way a person moves when every step costs something. 3 winters had passed since the fire, and Eli Bannister had learned to measure his whole world in steps and sounds, the way another man might measure it in miles. 14 steps carried him from the porch door to the well, and he had counted them so many thousands of times that his boots now found the worn groove in the dirt without any conscious thought behind it at all. 31 steps more took him from the well to the barn, so long as he kept his palm against the guide rope he had strung waist-high along the fence post the first spring after the burns healed enough to let him work again with his hands. He knew the ranch now the way he had once known his wife's face, by a memory laid down so deep it no longer needed checking, only trusting. He could tell a coming storm by the way the barn door hinge sang a half-tone lower than it did on a clear day, could tell which of his 3 horses had gone restless by the particular stamp of a hoof against packed earth at an hour when no hoof ought to be stamping. What he could not do, what no man in his condition could ever do, was see the woman he loved leave this world in the very same fire that had taken his sight from him. And that was the one measurement, the narrator would say, that Eli Bannister had never once managed to make peace with, no matter how many winters he counted past it. The fire had started in the hayloft on a night in late autumn, 3 years gone now, and Margaret had climbed the ladder ahead of him to fetch the lantern before it caught the dry straw underneath it. And it caught anyway, faster than either of them had ever believed straw could burn in this life. Eli remembered heat before he remembered anything else that followed, a wall of heat and a roar that swallowed her name whole the moment he called it into the smoke, and then the beam that came down hard across his face and left him in a darkness that never once lifted again after the smoke finally cleared over the ashes of that barn. He had lived. She had not. The county doctor who rode out from town told him plainly, in the flat voice doctors use for the truths they cannot soften, that a man could survive losing his eyes, but what he could not promise was that a man could survive losing the reason he still opened them each and every morning after. Eli had spent that first long year believing the doctor wrong on both counts, and some mornings, if he was honest with himself in the hour before dawn, he still did. He kept her Bible on the mantel exactly where she had left it the night before the fire, spine facing east the way she always said it, worn soft at the corners from her own reading, and he had never once asked Sarah to read it aloud to him, though the girl was old enough now, and patient enough besides, to have done it 100 times over without complaint. Some things a man keeps closed on purpose, the way a farmer keeps a gate shut on a field gone fallow, because an open wound left open too long stops healing and starts becoming who a man is instead of something that merely happened to him once. Eli had let his silence about the fire become exactly that kind of wound, year over year, without ever quite meaning for it to happen, the way most quiet ruin arrives, a little at a time, disguised as simple endurance. He could still recite whole passages from memory, having heard them read aloud so many Sunday evenings before the fire, and some nights, alone in the dark that never lifted, he mouthed them silently to himself, the way another man might worry a stone smooth in his pocket, more from habit than from any comfort he still expected them to give. Sarah had come to him the winter after the fire, 6 years old and already an orphan twice over by then. Her own mother, Eli's younger sister, taken by a fever that swept clean through Laramie one bad season and carried off half a street with it before the preacher could bury the first of the dead. Her father having been lost years earlier, still to a rock slide in the Bighorns that left no body to bury at all, only a hat found later that spring by a party of surveyors. She had arrived at his door with a carpet bag, a rag doll missing one button eye, and a silence of her own that matched his so exactly that neighbors said later the two of them had been carved from the same hard wood. She had grown up fast in a house with no woman left in it, and an uncle who could never see her growing. Learning her letters at the kitchen table by lamplight she did not truly need for herself. Learning to sweep a floor before anyone thought to ask her. Learning the particular weight of silence that settles over a house built by two people determined not to burden each other with their grief. She still set 2 cups out at breakfast some mornings, an old habit from a year she was too young to properly remember, and neither of them had ever found the heart to correct. And some mornings Eli caught himself reaching across the table for that second cup, before his mind caught up to what his hand already knew, and the reaching hurt him worse, every single time, than the remembering that followed close behind it. He never told her to stop setting it out. He had come, in his own quiet way, to need that small mistake more than he needed the correction of it. The same way a man keeps a lame horse past the point of usefulness, because putting it down would mean admitting something he is not yet ready to admit about the rest of his life. There were mornings the extra cup sat untouched by either of them straight through breakfast, cooling on the table like a held breath, and Sarah would clear it away without comment, and Eli would sit there afterward feeling the particular ache of a house that remembered more than the people living in it wished to. Somewhere along the way, without either of them deciding it on purpose, Sarah had taken to describing things to him unprompted. The exact color of a sunset bleeding out over the western ridge, the particular gold of a hawk circling low above the north pasture, the shade of a new calf's coat before it had even dried. She did it now not because he asked, the way he used to in that first hollowed-out year, but because it had slowly become their language, the one inheritance she had left to offer a man who had already given her the only home she had left in this world. She had a habit, too, of narrating the weather before he even asked after it. Clouds building gray in the west, or a hawk riding some current he could not feel yet from the ground. Small reports that cost her nothing and meant, to him, nearly everything a man could still be given in this life. He never once told her how much those small reports meant to him, how he turned them over at night the way another man might turn over a coin worn smooth from handling. But she knew anyway, the way children raised on quiet always come to know the things nobody around them says out loud. Tobias Reyes had worked the banister spread for 11 years before the fire ever touched it, a Mexican hand who had come north following work and stayed for reasons that had long since stopped being about wages, and he had simply remained afterward without ever once being asked to, the way an old dog remains by a hearth gone cold, rather than leave it to the weather. He had his own small cabin down past the second gate, built with his own hands the summer he first arrived, and though Eli had offered more than once over the years to raise his pay to match what a man of his skill could earn on a bigger outfit, Tobias always declined the same way, saying plainly that some places a man simply belongs to, wages or no wages. He had buried a wife and 2 children of his own to typhoid the year before Eli lost his sight to the fire, and that shared grief, never once spoken of directly between them, had made the 2 men something closer than employer and hired hand, something neither had a proper word for, and neither much needed one to feel it plainly. Tobias read the sky for coming weather and read the cattle for coming sickness, and more than either of those, he had learned to read Eli's moods the way a man reads a familiar trail after full dark, by feel alone, never by asking, and never by pressing where a man did not wish to be pressed. It was Tobias who had rigged the guide ropes that first hard spring after the burns healed. Tobias who had taught Eli to notch the fence posts with a count only the 2 of them understood. Tobias who never once in 3 years offered the kind of soft pity that would have ended their friendship on the spot, and both men knew it without either saying so. It was Tobias, too, who had ridden into town alone the week after the funeral to buy the black mourning cloth Eli could not see to choose for himself, and who had never once mentioned that errand again in all the years since, the way a good friend buries a kindness the same day he does it. Between the three of them, the ranch had somehow held together through 2 winters, bad enough to break outfits twice its size all across Sweetwater County, cattle prices falling twice in one season, and a banknote in town that grew a little heavier every quarter. It went unmentioned at supper. Eli had told himself, more than once and usually in the dead hours before sleep, that a hollowed-out blind man and 2 strays who had nowhere better to go were as much of a family as this hard, unyielding country was ever going to allow a man like him to keep. And most days that thought was enough to get him back up before first light. He believed it plainly enough on the morning the dog first started growling at nothing, and he believed it still an hour later, when the growling had climbed from simple warning to something closer to fury, low and constant in the animal's throat, aimed steady down the long gray ribbon of the county road at whatever kept drawing nearer, without once announcing itself by voice, the way a stranger with honest business in mind generally does the moment he comes within hailing distance of a homestead. Sarah had watched from the window most of that morning, reporting nothing, which itself was its own kind of report, and Tobias had ridden the fence line twice without finding cause for the animal's temper, and still the dog would not settle, not through the noon meal, not through the long gray hours of an afternoon that refused to resolve itself one way or the other. Sweetwater County itself had a way of testing every soul who tried to make a living from it, a hard, wind-scoured stretch of Wyoming range where the winters ran long and merciless, and the summers, brief as they were, burned the prairie grass gold within weeks of the last frost breaking. Neighbors were counted in miles rather than yards, the nearest in this case being the Whitfield spread 6 miles east, and mail came only as often as someone happened to be riding toward town and thought to ask after it. It was not a country that forgave carelessness, nor one that offered much comfort to a man already halved by grief and darkness, and yet Eli had stayed on it stubbornly, the way a man stays anywhere that still holds the bones of people he loved, because leaving would have felt like a second kind of burying. Evening fell before the shape ever resolved into anything Eli could properly make sense of by sound alone, footsteps too light and too uneven to belong to any grown man he knew, boots dragging low every few strides, as though the legs beneath them had long since stopped agreeing to keep on carrying their owner another mile toward whatever destination they were bound for. And then, just past dusk, with Sarah already latching the shutters tight against the coming night and Tobias still outsettling the horses, the porch boards groaned under a weight that was not Tobias coming in from the north pasture, and was not Sarah crossing from the spring house, and had never once in 3 long winters climbed those particular steps before, a weight so light it seemed almost afraid of the sound it made. The girl who climbed the last rise of the county road that evening wore a coat 2 sizes too large for her, a man's coat, borrowed or stolen or given by someone who would never say which now, and it did nothing at all against a wind that still carried winter's teeth this late in the season. Her boots, city-made and never meant for prairie mud, had gone the color of the road itself, caked past the ankle, and she favored her left foot in a way that spoke of a blister long since torn open and walked on anyway, because stopping had not been an option available to her for some days now. She carried nothing but a small cloth bundle held tight against her chest, held the way a woman holds the one thing she is left to protect after everything else has already been taken from her, and she stopped 3 separate times on that final rise to look back down the road she'd come up, as though counting the exact distance between herself and whatever she still believed was following her out of Cheyenne. She had walked the better part of 4 nights to reach Bannister Ridge, sleeping in fence corners and one abandoned line shack half fallen to its own weight, eating what little she could beg or find along a road that offered neither freely, and the rope burns beneath her 2 thin sleeves had scabbed over twice already, and torn open once more in the 2 days since she left the last of what she used to call her life behind her for good. She did not know the name of the ranch she was approaching, only that an old hired man on the road 2 days back, whom she had begged directions from without giving her own name in return, had told her the Bannister place kept honest wages and asked no questions a body did not wish to answer aloud. That had been enough for her to walk on. It would have to be enough, because she had nothing else left in this world to bargain with. At the gate, she stopped a long moment, one hand on the cold iron latch, weighing something only the narrator could have named plainly for her, which was pride measured directly against hunger. And for a girl raised to believe those two things ought never once touch, the weighing cost her more than the walking had cost her whole. Behind her, the county road stretched back empty toward the horizon, gray and featureless as a held breath, and she made herself stop looking at it before it could talk her legs into turning around one final time. She knocked before she could talk herself back down that road into the coming dark. Sarah reached the door first, quick as she always was about everything, and went entirely still at the sight of a stranger swaying slightly on the top step, mud caked to the knee and hollow-eyed and trying, visibly trying, to stand straighter than her body currently had any strength left to allow. The girl said nothing to Sarah beyond a small, careful nod, the kind offered by someone unsure whether even a nod might be taken wrong in a strange place. And Sarah, 8 years old and no stranger herself to grief wearing an unfamiliar face, called for her uncle without once taking her eyes off the visitor. Something in the way the stranger held herself, spine straight despite everything the road had done to her, reminded Sarah of the way she herself had once stood at this same door with a carpet bag and a doll missing one button eye. And perhaps that was why the child did not think to be afraid. For a moment nobody moved, the whole yard suspended in the particular stillness that settles over a homestead, when a household realizes, all at once, that the evening ahead of them will not resemble the one they had planned. Even the chickens in the near coop had gone quiet, as though they too understood something had shifted on the wind. Eli came onto the porch with his cane, finding the top step by old memory, and he did not ask who stood there before he had already begun reading her the only way left to him, by the unevenness of her breathing, quick and shallow, and working visibly hard to sound calmer than it truly was, and by the small tremor that ran up through her knuckles the instant she gripped the porch rail to steady herself against a wind that was not, in honest truth, blowing especially hard that particular evening. He said nothing for a long moment, only stood there letting the silence do the work. Silence does best on a working ranch, which is tell two strangers the truth about each other faster than any words generally manage between them. He could smell the road on her plainly, dust and wet wool, and something underneath both he recognized without wanting to. The particular smell of a person who has not slept indoors in longer than pride will let them admit out loud. It was a smell he remembered from his own first winter without sight, when he too had gone days forgetting to wash, simply because grief had left him no room to care, and recognizing it in a stranger now softened something in him faster than her words alone could have managed. Her breathing slowed by small degrees the longer he simply stood there without demanding a single thing of her, and something in that patience, so unlike whatever she had run from in the dark behind her, seemed to loosen the set of her shoulders by some small but visible measure that even Sarah noticed from the doorway. She had expected, she realized, to be looked over the way a horse is looked over at auction, and instead she was simply being waited for, which was a kindness so unfamiliar it nearly undid her composure before she had said a single word. She opened her mouth to speak at last, the words gathering slow behind lips chapped raw from 4 nights of prairie wind, and the whole porch, Sarah included, went so quiet that even the dog stopped its restless pacing at the step to listen for whatever was coming next. Somewhere out past the barn, a hinge creaked once in the rising wind and fell still again, as though the whole ranch itself had leaned in closer to hear what a stranger had walked 4 nights to say. She said it plain, no tremor left in it now that the words had finally come out of her. She was not asking for charity. She could cook, mend, scrub, tend a garden or a sickbed, whatever needed tending on a place like this, and she would take honest wages for honest work, and nothing more than that from any man alive. Eli did not answer right away. He turned the offer over the way he turned over a coin he could not see but could still weigh by feel alone, and what struck him hardest was not the offer itself, but the steadiness she had forced into her own voice to deliver it, a steadiness that cost her something he recognized plainly, because it cost him the same thing most mornings of his own life. Sarah, standing half behind him in the doorway, watched the stranger the way she watched a new foal test its legs for the first time, uncertain yet whether to be afraid of it or fond of it. He asked her only one question, and he asked it plain, the way a man asks a thing he actually intends to hear the answer to. Was she running from the law, or from something crueler than the law had ever managed to be to a person? She was quiet a long moment before she answered him, and when she finally did, she gave him a truth half told, the only kind she had left to spare a stranger. A man believed she belonged to him, she said, the way a debt believes it owns whatever was pledged against it. And she did not, and she never would again, as long as she had legs enough left in her to walk away from him. Her voice did not break on the words, though it came close, and Eli heard that closeness plainly, even if he could not see the effort it took to hold it back. Eli considered that answer longer than he considered most things put in front of him, weighing the half of it she had given against the half she had plainly kept back. And he decided, the way a man decides most things that matter in this life, not with his eyes, which had nothing left to offer him, but with something further down and harder to name that had rarely steered him wrong. He thought briefly and without meaning to, of Margaret standing on this same porch 9 years before, asking him for exactly nothing and offering exactly everything. And he let that memory settle rather than fight it. He offered her a cot in the loft and wages paid out weekly, and he called it labor plainly, twice over, so there could be no mistaking it later for anything gentler than what it actually was between them. Sarah, still watching from the doorway, asked plainly whether the stranger would be staying for supper, and Eli, caught somewhere between the gravity of the moment and the plain practicality of a hungry child's question, allowed himself the smallest laugh he had managed in longer than he could readily recall, and said that yes, she supposed she would. Before we go further into what came of that bargain, tell me plainly where you are watching this from tonight, because a story like this one is always better shared than watched alone in silence. And if it has already caught hold of something in you the way it caught hold of Eli that evening, go on and subscribe to this channel and leave the video a like, because there is a long road left to travel together before this one is finished. They shook on it there on the porch, her hands small and cold and still trembling faintly inside his hand steady from long practice at trusting exactly what he could not see. Neither one of them could have said, in that particular moment, whether they were shaking on a simple arrangement of chores and wages, or on something else entirely that neither of them yet had a word for. Sarah, watching the handshake from the doorway, decided then and there, in the plain and certain way children decide things, that the stranger would be staying, and went inside to make up the cot in the loft before anyone had asked her to. The narrator, who sees further into a bargain than either party ever can on the very day it is struck, understood already that some agreements cost a great deal more than either side has counted, and that the reckoning for this one, whatever shape it finally took, had only just begun on that cold porch at the edge of Sweetwater County. The first morning, Josephine rose before the roosters out of habit more than duty, and she stood a long while in the kitchen doorway, simply listening, learning the house the way she had once learned, out of necessity, to read a room full of strangers back in Cheyenne, by sound and by the small tells a body gives off without meaning to. She found the flour bin by feel before she found it by sight, since the kitchen kept its own kind of darkness before dawn, and she had the stove lit and biscuits rising by the time Eli came down counting his 14 steps from the loft ladder to the table, and he stopped short in the doorway, head tilted, working out from the smell alone that something in his kitchen had changed for the better, without his ever having asked for it. Outside, the windmill turned its same tired song, and inside, for the first time in 3 winters, that song had company. He did not thank her outright that first morning, and she did not expect him to, because they had agreed on labor and not on gratitude, and both of them, in their own separate ways, found that arrangement easier to live inside than the alternative would have been. Still, when he sat down to biscuits lighter than any he had eaten since Margaret's hands last made them, he allowed himself one small sentence, that the coffee was strong enough to wake a dead man, and Josephine, standing at the stove with her back to him, let herself smile for the first time since Cheyenne, where nobody had smiled at her cooking in longer than she cared to remember plainly. Sarah, watching the two of them over her own plate, said nothing at all, but she ate a second biscuit that morning, which in that house had always counted for something. Within the week she had found Eli's desk, and on it, tucked half beneath a Bible he never opened, a ledger gone to disarray, columns crossed out and recopied wrong, a mortgage note from the Sweetwater County Bank 3 months behind on a payment Eli believed, wrongly, that Tobias had already made on his behalf. She said nothing to him about it that first night, only sat by lamplight after the household had gone quiet and worked the figures over twice with a pencil stub, the way her own father had once taught her before his debt swallowed him whole. And by the time the candle guttered low, she had found the error. A column added instead of subtracted, costing the ranch $11. It did not actually owe the bank at all. She sat a long while after that, staring at the corrected sum, thinking of her father's own ledgers. How neat his columns had always looked right up until the year they betrayed him entirely. She brought it to him the next morning, plain and businesslike, the way she had learned to bring bad news to men who did not care to be surprised by it later. And Eli sat very still while she read the figures aloud to him twice over. And when she finished, he asked her carefully, where a runaway girl with rope burns on her wrists had learned to read numbers like a banker in Cheyenne. She told him only that her father had kept books for other men's fortunes before losing his own to ruin. And Eli, who had learned long ago not to press where a person had chosen not to open a door on their own, let the matter rest there, though something in him had shifted, quiet and permanent, toward a respect he had not expected to feel this soon in a stranger's employ. From that morning forward, the ledger sat openly on the desk rather than hidden beneath the Bible, and neither of them remarked on the change, though both of them noticed it plainly. Sarah took to her slower, the way a child raised on loss takes to anything new, testing first with silence and small chores done alongside rather than with words offered outright to a stranger. It was over a torn quilt, one of Margaret's old ones, that the two of them finally found their way past that silence. Josephine's needles small and even, Sarah's clumsy and eager. The two of them bent together over the same worn cotton by the hearth, while Eli sat nearby pretending not to listen to every single word passing between them that evening. Sarah asked, at one point, whether Josephine had ever sewn a quilt of her own, and Josephine said only that she had started one once, back home, and never finished it, and left it plain at that. There were quieter mornings, too, ordinary in a way that only a household once broken can fully appreciate. Mornings when Josephine hung wash on the line while Sarah chased a barn cat through the yard, and Eli sat on the porch mending a bridle by feel, all three of them moving through their separate chores in a silence that had stopped, somewhere along the way, feeling like the silence of strangers, and started feeling instead like the comfortable quiet of people who no longer needed constant talk to know they belonged in the same place. Sarah asked her, without warning, the way children ask the questions grown women spend years learning to dodge gracefully, whether Josephine had a mother waiting on her somewhere back east. Josephine's needle stilled a moment before she answered that she did not anymore, and Sarah, instead of retreating from the answer the way Josephine half expected her to, simply nodded and said that she did not have one either, and that maybe that made the two of them something like family already, and neither one of them thought to correct her on it. Eli, listening from his chair by the fire, found his own throat tight in a way he had not expected, and said nothing at all, only reached for his coffee to have something to do with his hands. The tension broke another way entirely on an afternoon when a rider passed on the county road at a trot, nothing more than a farmer heading toward town, and Josephine dropped the basin she was carrying so hard it cracked against the porch boards, her whole body gone rigid, her breath coming too fast and too shallow for a sound as ordinary as hoofbeats passing at a distance behind the fence line. Eli, who could not see her face go white, heard everything else plainly enough, the basin, the breathing, the silence that followed it, and he crossed the yard by rope and memory until he found her shoulder with his hand and simply stood there, saying nothing at all, until her breathing found its own way back down to something closer to steady again. Sarah, watching from the window, started forward before Eli's raised hand stopped her gently, a small motion that told the child plainer than any words could that some fear needs quiet more than it needs company crowding in around it. Later that evening, Josephine apologized for the broken basin, and Eli told her plainly that a basin was replaceable, and she was not, which was the closest either of them had come yet to saying something neither was ready to name outright. He did not ask her what she had seen in her mind during those long seconds, because he already understood, without needing the particulars spelled out, that whatever she was running from rode a horse and knew her by name, and that knowledge alone was enough to make him listen to the county road a little more carefully himself from then on, blind as he was to whatever might come riding up it one day. That night he asked Tobias, quietly, to keep the shotgun loaded and near the door, and he gave no reason for the request, and Tobias, who had learned not to ask Eli twice about anything said in that particular tone of voice, simply nodded and saw it done before supper. Josephine noticed the shotgun's new place by the door the following morning and said nothing about it either, though something in her shoulders eased slightly at the sight of it. In the evenings, when the chores were done and Sarah had gone up to bed, Eli took Margaret's Bible down from the mantel for the first time in 3 winters and asked Josephine, plainly, whether she would read a passage aloud to him, since his own eyes could no longer do it, and his own voice had never quite managed the words alone in an empty room. She read slow and careful by the hearth fire, and he listened the way a starving man listens to a meal being described to him in detail. And some nights neither of them made it past a single page before the silence between the words grew as important as the words themselves had ever been. He told her once, quietly, that Margaret's voice had carried the same particular hush over certain verses, and Josephine did not ask which ones, only read on a little softer from that point forward, as though she understood the gift she had just been handed and did not wish to hold it carelessly. Here I want to ask you something, and I would love to hear your honest answer down in the comments. Have you ever trusted someone the way Eli trusted Josephine? Not because you had any proof at all of who they truly were, but simply because your own instinct told you plainly that they were safe to lean on. Sit with that question a moment, because it sits at the very center of everything this story is quietly building toward. It was on one of those quiet evenings that Tobias very nearly traded away 6 head of cattle to a buyer passing through from Casper, a deal that looked fair enough on its face and would have cost the ranch dear once the calving season turned the numbers against them later. And it was Josephine, sitting quiet at the edge of the porch with her mending in her lap, who spoke up before the handshake sealed it, laying out the arithmetic plain enough that even the buyer nodded and revised his offer upward on the spot without argument. Tobias tipped his hat to her afterward, an old habit from a more formal life, and said only that he would be a fool not to bring his figures past her from then on out. Word of the cattle deal traveled, as word does in a county that small, and within days 2 neighboring ranchers had ridden out under the pretense of borrowing tools just to get a look at the girl who had bested a Casper buyer without raising her voice once. Josephine bore their curious looks the same way she bore everything else that summer, with a quiet dignity that gave the gossips little to chew on and sent most of them home instead simply admiring her. Tobias said little else about it afterward, but from that evening on he brought his own doubts to her before he brought them to anyone else on the place. And Eli, hearing the shift in how his oldest hand now spoke of her, understood plainly that whatever Josephine had once been back in Cheyenne, she had become, in the space of a few short weeks, something Bannister Ridge could no longer easily do without at all. He found himself, more than once that month, asking her opinion on matters he would never have thought to raise with anyone but Tobias before, whether to sell a portion of the summer hay or hold it against a hard winter, whether the new well needed digging before autumn or could wait another season. And each time she answered him plain and unadorned, the way a person answers who has learned the hard way that flattery costs a body more than honesty ever does. Sarah began leaving her door open at night, a habit she had not kept since her own mother died, because she said the house sounded less empty with Josephine's voice carrying faintly through it, humming some tune from a childhood she rarely spoke of otherwise to anyone. Eli, lying awake in his own room down the hall, found himself listening for that same humming most nights now, and told himself it was only relief at Sarah sleeping easier, though he suspected, even blind as he was, that he was not being fully honest with himself about which of the 2 of them he was actually listening for each night. One night the humming stopped short partway through, and he lay awake a long while after, oddly unsettled by the silence where the small comfort of it used to be. There came an evening when Josephine, without being asked, described a sunset to him the way Sarah so often did, the exact rose gold bleeding low over the western ridge, the long shadows the fence posts threw clean across the yard at that hour, and Eli sat very still on the porch step listening to her voice paint a picture he would never see again with his own eyes, and something in his chest loosened that had stayed clenched shut since the night of the fire 3 winters gone. He asked her, when she finished, to describe it again a different way, and she laughed softly and did, finding new words for the same gold light, and he decided then that he could listen to her find new words for the same sunset every evening for the rest of his life, and never once tire of it. He did not tell her that Margaret used to describe sunsets to him the very same way, In the years before, the fire took both his sight and her voice from him in the same night. But Josephine, watching him closely enough by then to read the particular stillness that came over him, seemed to understand it anyway without needing the words spelled out plainly for her. She reached over, after a long quiet, and set her hand briefly over his on the porch rail, not holding it, only resting there a moment, and Eli let it stay exactly where it was rather than pull away the way he might have a month before. One Sunday, with no preacher due through Sweetwater County for another month, Eli asked Josephine to read the morning service herself, the way Margaret once had before the fire, and she stood at the head of the table with Sarah's hand in hers and Tobias's hat off and pressed to his chest, and read the old familiar verses in a voice that trembled only once, at a line about the Lord restoring what the years had taken, before steadying itself through to the end. Nobody said much afterward. Nobody needed to. Later that same week, Eli taught her to tell a healthy calf from a sickly one by ear alone, the particular rasp of a labored breath against a clean one, and she stood beside him in the pen with her hand over his so she could feel exactly where he was listening, and for a moment neither of them was thinking about ledgers or debts or men riding roads at all, only about the small, ordinary miracle of two people teaching each other to see the world in the only ways left available to them. He showed her, too, how to read a coming storm off the particular way the cattle bunched themselves along the north fence line, a skill his own father had taught him decades before on this same stretch of ground, and she committed each small lesson to memory the careful way she had once committed her father's ledgers, as though nothing offered to her freely should ever be allowed to go to waste. Sarah, watching the two of them from the fence rail, declared that she wanted to learn every one of those same tricks too, and Eli told her plainly that she already knew most of them without realizing it, since she had been reading his moods by ear since she was 6 years old. There was, in that same stretch of weeks, a morning when a late frost threatened the first tender shoots of the kitchen garden Josephine had planted along the south wall, and the three of them worked past midnight by lantern light, hauling burlap and old feed sacks to cover the rows, Sarah running between them with pins in her mouth like a seamstress at a hem, Tobias grumbling good-naturedly about women who insisted on turnips before the last frost had properly finished its business. By the time they finished, none of the garden had been lost, and Eli, sitting on the porch step catching his breath, remarked that he could not recall the last time exhaustion had felt so thoroughly earned and so entirely worth it. The county held its early summer social not long after, a barn dance 2 farms over that drew half of Sweetwater County out of their houses for one bright evening, and Tobias insisted the whole household attend, arguing plainly that a ranch that never showed its face in town bred more suspicion than one that did. Josephine went pale at the suggestion, and Eli, reading her hesitation clean through the silence that followed it, told her only that she need not dance with a soul if she did not care to, and that he himself would be glad of an arm to walk in on, since his own legs had grown rusty at social graces these past 3 winters. She stood at the edge of that dance most of the evening with Eli beside her, watching, in her own careful way, for any face that did not belong among the familiar ranching families of the county, and found none. And by the time the fiddler struck up a slow number near the evening's end, she had loosened enough to let Sarah pull her out onto the swept dirt floor for one clumsy, laughing turn that drew a few kind smiles from the older women watching. An older widow named Mrs. Halloway, who had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of the county's gossip about it, remarked to Eli that the girl he had taken on seemed to carry herself like someone who had once known a very different kind of life, and Eli, giving nothing away, only said that a person's past was their own business and none of the county's. Eli, standing at the edge with Tobias, heard her laugh clear across the barn for the first time since she'd come up his lane, and he found he could have listened to that sound the rest of his days and called it wages enough for any labor asked of him. There was an evening, not long after the dance, when Eli asked Josephine plainly whether she intended to stay past the summer, or whether she still thought of Bannister Ridge as a place to rest before moving on toward somewhere safer and farther from Cheyenne. She did not answer right away, and when she did, she said only that she had stopped thinking of anywhere as temporary the day Sarah called her sister, and that a woman could only run from so many things before she decided some ground was worth standing on instead. Eli said nothing in reply, but the set of his shoulders eased in a way Tobias noticed clear across the yard the next morning. Not every night that followed was so easy. Sarah woke twice that same week from dreams of the fever that had taken her mother, and it was Josephine, not Eli, who sat with her in the dark until the shaking passed, humming the same tune Eli had grown used to hearing through the wall, and telling her, plain and certain, that grief visits everyone eventually, and leaves everyone eventually too, though it never quite tells you which night it plans to do either. Eli found himself, some evenings, standing at the fence line long after the chores were finished, simply listening to the ordinary sounds of a household that had, without his quite noticing the exact day it happened, stopped sounding like a house of grief. Sarah's laughter carried differently now than it had a month before, looser somehow, and Josephine's voice moving between kitchen and garden had become a sound his ears searched for the moment it went quiet too long. He did not examine that searching too closely, the way a man avoids poking at an old wound to see whether it is finally closed, content instead simply to notice that the poking no longer seemed necessary. 3 weeks in, the ranch had settled into a rhythm none of them spoke of directly, but all three felt plainly enough. Biscuits rising before dawn, ledgers balanced by lamplight, a child's door left open through the night, a blind man's hand finding a porch rail with less hesitation than it had found anything in 3 long winters past. It was, none of them would have said aloud just yet, beginning to feel like the kind of house a family actually lived in, rather than the kind of house 3 strangers merely shared under one roof. Josephine had begun, by late summer, to speak more freely of small pieces of her old life, never the worst of it, but the ordinary parts. A mother's recipe for dried apple pie, a game she and her sister used to play on the porch steps of a house that no longer existed for her in any way that mattered. Eli listened to each fragment the way a man listens to a language he is only beginning to learn, gathering the pieces carefully, never pressing for more than she offered on her own. And Sarah listened too, wide-eyed, already treating each small story as though it belonged to their family's own history, now as much as it belonged to Josephine's. Then, on a gray Tuesday that started no differently than any other before it, Tobias rode back from town later than expected, and Eli heard it plainly in the particular unevenness of his hoofbeats coming up the lane, a rhythm that told him, before a single word was spoken aloud, that whatever Tobias had learned in Sweetwater's one dusty street had not been good news for anybody living at Bannister Ridge that season. It was harvest season by then, in every practical sense, the wheat in the low fields standing tall and ready, and the whole household had spent that particular morning cutting and binding under a sky so clear it seemed almost mocking of what was coming, none of them yet aware that the day's real harvest would turn out to be considerably harder than wheat. Sarah had spent the afternoon stacking sheaves half her own height, proud of everyone, and Josephine had laughed more freely that day than Eli had heard her laugh since the barn dance, which made what Tobias carried home with him all the crueler in its timing. Tobias came into the yard pale beneath his weathered color, and he did not wait for pleasantries before he said it plain that a man had passed through town that very afternoon, asking after a runaway girl by name, offering silver to anyone who could point him toward Sweetwater County's outlying ranches, and that the name he had used, spoken careful and deliberate at the mercantile counter, was Josephine's own name exactly. Silas Pruitt arrived at Bannister Ridge 2 mornings later, and Eli heard him coming long before Tobias ever called a warning from the barn, the particular clip of a well-fed horse pulling a buggy far too fine for county roads, wheels that had plainly never known real mud before that week of travel out from Cheyenne. A second rider trailed him close behind, silent and broad-shouldered, the kind of hired man who spoke with his presence far more than with his mouth, and the dog's low growl returned in full the moment both riders crossed the cattle guard onto Bannister land. Josephine, elbow-deep in dishwater at the window, went still at the sound of that particular buggy before she even saw it clearly, the way a body remembers a threat in its bones long before the mind finishes naming it. The dust of their arrival had not even settled before Sarah ran to fetch Josephine from the spring house, breathless, saying only that the man from the road had finally come, and Josephine had gone very pale herself, setting down the pail of milk she carried with hands that had, until that moment, stopped shaking weeks before. Pruitt did not dismount right away. He sat in his buggy a long moment, letting the ranch take in his tailored coat and city boots, the way a man lets a room look him over before he ever says a single word aloud. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed by anybody standing in front of him. Eli stepped onto the porch at the sound of it, cane in hand, Sarah's small footsteps close behind him, and the whole yard seemed to hold its breath waiting to see which of the two men present would speak first. He asked for Josephine Calloway by her full name, plain and businesslike, the same way a debt collector asks after any piece of overdue property left too long unpaid, and he informed Eli, without preamble or apology, that she belonged, by written contract, to a marriage her late father's creditors had arranged before his death to settle accounts owed to Pruitt's own house back in Cheyenne. He spoke of her the way a man speaks of a promissory note come due, without once using a word that acknowledged she might be standing close enough to hear every syllable of it herself. He produced the paper itself from a leather case at his side and held it up, though no one on that porch could read it from where he sat. A gesture meant more for its own performance than for any real proof it carried. Eli's face gave away nothing at all, though his hand had gone very still on the porch rail beside him. He said only that no soul on his ranch belonged to any man alive, and that if Pruitt carried papers claiming otherwise, the county judge in Sweetwater would be glad to look them over plainly before anybody left this porch with anybody else against their will. His voice did not rise, though the grip of his hand on the rail told a different story to anyone close enough to notice it. Pruitt laughed softly at that, unbothered, and remarked, almost gently, that it must be a hard thing for a blind man to keep hold of anything at all in this world, land included, and that he happened to know, from a friendly conversation with a bank clerk earlier that very week, that the note on Bannister Ridge sat 3 full months behind and climbing steadily with each passing quarter. He let that piece of knowledge sit in the air a moment, the way a card player lets a strong hand sit unplayed just long enough for the other side to feel its weight. Sarah pressed close against Josephine's skirt on the porch, small fingers gripping the worn fabric white-knuckled, and Josephine stood very still herself, her own fear folded down small and quiet the way a person learns to fold fear when a child is watching them closely for a cue on exactly how afraid the moment truly calls for. Tobias, standing off to one side with the shotgun still broken open over his arm, watched Pruitt's face the entire time with the flat, patient attention of a man who had learned long ago exactly how much weight a smooth voice could carry before it finally cracked. I want to ask you plainly, because this is the kind of moment a story like this one always turns on. If you had been standing on that porch yourself, would you have trusted the smooth voice holding the papers, or the quiet fear in the girl standing beside you saying nothing at all? Tell me in the comments below, because I promise you it is rarely as simple a question as it first sounds. Pruitt's hired men dismounted then and took 2 slow steps toward the porch steps, and Tobias moved without a single word to stand between him and the house, shotgun broken open over one arm, but close enough at hand that everyone present understood exactly what it meant without his needing to say it plainly. The hired man stopped where he stood, weighing the old ranch hand's stillness against whatever wages Pruitt was paying him, and plainly decided the wages were not worth what came next if he pressed the matter any further that morning. Pruitt's smile thinned just barely at that, and he said he would return at first light with the county sheriff and the note holder from the bank both riding beside him, and that a blind rancher would do well to consider, overnight, just how much he truly wished to lose over a runaway housemaid who was never rightfully his to keep in the first place. He said it lightly, the way a man says something he expects will keep a household awake all night turning it over, and in that much, at least, he was not wrong. His hired man climbed back onto his own horse without a word, and the two of them sat their mounts a moment longer at the edge of the yard, surveying the small, stubborn household they had just threatened, before finally turning back down the lane toward town. Josephine, still standing on the porch with Sarah pressed against her, felt the old familiar urge rise in her to simply run again, to vanish into the dark before dawn could bring the sheriff and settle the matter one way or another without her having any say in it at all. It was Eli's hand finding her shoulder, steady and certain, that kept her rooted to the boards beneath her feet, and she understood, in that touch, that he intended to fight for her the same way he fought for anything else on this hard, unyielding land, plainly and without asking permission first. He turned his buggy without waiting for any answer, the wheels cutting fresh ruts into the softened mud of the yard, and the sound of it faded slow down the county road while the whole ranch stood frozen in the settling dust behind him, none of them speaking a word, all of them understanding plainly that whatever fragile peace they had built these past weeks now had less than a single night left to survive it. Tobias broke the silence first, saying only that he would ride for the county clerk himself before first light, and Eli, still gripping the porch rail, nodded once and said that tonight, at last, they would need every scrap of paper Josephine had ever put her honest signature to. That night, Eli asked Josephine for the whole truth, not the half she had offered on the porch that first evening, and she gave it to him at last, sitting by the dying hearth fire while Sarah slept upstairs unaware of how much hung on the hours before dawn. The forced betrothal, her father's debt sold like cattle at auction, the rope that had held her the first time she tried to run, and the second rope, crueler than the first, that had held her the time after that. Eli listened without interrupting once, and when she finished, he did not say he was sorry, because sorry was cheap, and he had never dealt in cheap things. He said only that a debt cannot buy a person, only a promise, and that no promise made by a dying man over his daughter's body could ever hold up under honest law, whatever fine words Cheyenne had dressed it in. He sent Tobias to fetch the county clerk before first light, along with the wage ledger Josephine herself had kept faithful and signed each week in her own hand. Proof, plain and dated, that she was a hired woman earning honest pay, not property owed to any man's account. Tobias rode out into the dark without a single question asked, the way a man rides who has already decided which side of a fight he stands on long before the fight itself arrives. The county clerk arrived just before sunrise, a small, precise man named Whitcomb, who had ridden half asleep the whole way out and woke fully only once he understood exactly what he had been summoned to witness. He read the ledger over twice by lamplight, checked the dates against his own county records, and signed his own name beneath Josephine's final entry without being asked twice. Dawn brought Pruitt back as promised, the sheriff riding beside him looking tired and unconvinced already. Pruitt held up his papers first, loud and certain, the way a man performs certainty when he suspects it is already slipping. Eli held up the ledger instead and asked the clerk, plain and steady, to read the dates aloud for the sheriff's benefit. 6 weeks of wages paid, witnessed, signed, each entry in a hand that matched the very hand Whitcomb had watched sign the county record not 2 hours before. A woman working her own land by her own choice, and nothing in any book of law that said otherwise. The sheriff studied both documents a long moment, then looked hard at Pruitt's hired man, who would not meet his eyes and would not, when pressed, swear under oath that Josephine had ever been anything but free to leave whenever she pleased. The silence that followed that refusal said more than any testimony could have. Pruitt's face went the color of old ash. He argued the law was his, that a debt was a debt regardless of who held the paper. The sheriff told him, flat and final, that Wyoming did not sell women, whatever Cheyenne's paper claimed, and that he would be riding home now without her. Pruitt's buggy pulled away empty for the second time, the wheels quieter this time, defeated rather than triumphant, and the whole ranch stood in the thin morning light listening to it fade, none of them quite believing, not yet, that it was truly over. Josephine's hand found Eli's without either of them reaching for it on purpose, and it stayed there long after the last of the wheels had gone silent down the county road. That harvest eased into a quiet winter, and by the time spring returned to Bannister Ridge the following year, the fence posts Eli had notched now marked not just his own careful steps, but Josephine's too, since she had taken to walking the guide rope alongside him some evenings for no reason but the company of it. The rope burns on her wrists had faded to thin pale lines by then, the kind a person only notices anymore if they know to look for them, and she no longer flinched at the sound of a rider on the county road, though Eli noticed she still counted the hoofbeats out of habit until they passed clean by and out of earshot. The mortgage note, too, had been paid current at last, thanks to a ledger kept honest by a hand that had once balanced far crueler men's fortunes than his own, and the bank clerk who had once spoken so freely to Silas Pruitt found, in the following months, considerably less reason to speak of Bannister Ridge's business to anyone at all. The circuit preacher came through Sweetwater County that first Sunday of true summer, later than expected, but welcome all the same, and he blessed the household plain and simple at the kitchen table, Eli's hand resting on Josephine's, Sarah's small fingers wrapped around both of theirs. Sarah had taken, some weeks back now, to calling Josephine her sister without a second thought, and nobody at that table saw fit to correct her on it, because by then it had simply become true in every way that mattered. The preacher, an old traveling man who had blessed half the households in the county over the years, remarked afterward that he had rarely seen a table so quietly certain of itself. Tobias stood in the doorway through the blessing, hat in hand, and said afterward only that the ranch felt like a ranch again, which from a man of so few words was as fine a thing as he had ever said about any of them. He went back out to the horses within the hour, same as always, though he lingered a moment longer at the gate than the chores strictly required, looking back once at the house with something close to satisfaction settling into the lines of his weathered face. By autumn the garden had come in full and heavy, rows of squash and turnips and late corn all standing ready at once, and Josephine stood canning the last of it in a kitchen that smelled of tomatoes and cinnamon and wood smoke, Sarah underfoot demanding to help with jobs her small hands were not quite ready for, and Eli standing in the doorway listening to the both of them argue good-naturedly over a paring knife, thought that if a man had told him a year before that this was the life waiting for him past the fire, he would not have believed a single word of it, and would have counted himself a fool for hoping. The narrator, looking back on it the way a narrator does from some distance the people living a story never get to have, would say this plainly. Some debts in this life are paid in coin, and some are paid in the plainer, harder currency of showing up, staying put, and choosing another person's freedom over your own comfort, day after ordinary day, until it stops being a choice at all and simply becomes the shape of a life well lived. A blind man had seen more truth in a trembling pair of hands than most men ever manage with two good eyes wide open, and that, the narrator would say, was the whole of the lesson worth keeping.